excited about our next guest. He really is a Renaissance man. He's a scholar, he's a builder, a founder of the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy. And of course, at heart, he's an ideas man. He is a writer, and he's got a new book. It's called The Victim Cult: How the Grievance Culture is Wrecking Civilization. What a pleasure to be joined now by our friend Mark Milke, who joins us from Calgary. Mark, great to see you again, and congratulations on the new book.
Ezra, thanks for having me. And, I'm happy to have this new book out. So it's great to be interviewed on it.
You know, it is so easy emotionally to give up and say, I'm a victim. I am not the captain of my own ship. Bad things that happen to me, it's someone else who did this to me. Therefore, I don't have to take responsibility for it. I can mope, and there's sort of a misery loves company thing. There is some satisfaction in moping and blaming others. But that's not the right way to be for people. It's not the right way to be for entire nations, is it? Tell me more about your thesis behind the victim cult.
Sure. Well, the reason I wrote this book, and it took a very long time to write, about 7 years in total, is because I've done a lot of work on Indigenous issues over the years. And there are some tremendous examples of Indigenous leaders who say, look, obviously some harm and some discrimination was rife in Canadian history. But the person who wrote the foreword to the victim cult, Ellis Ross, former First Nations elected chief in British Columbia, on the coast of British Columbia with a Haisla Nation, set the tone for the book in that you can't allow the past to trap you as a person or as a group of people in the past, because that's no way to create a better future without being flippant about it, right? And Ellis is not, and I'm not in the book. The danger is when people concentrate on the past and the victimization, sometimes it's imagined and sometimes it's real. And we shouldn't deny the latter. When you concentrate on the past to a great degree and blame everything in the present on the past, you really go in circles. And you see flourishing cultures around the world in history, which is part of what this book did, that even when they were heavily discriminated against, as Indigenous Canadians were in the past, as Asian Canadians were between 1850 and 1950, literally in law and in policy, and Jewish people, as you all know, Ezra, also discriminated against in institutional ways before the 1950s, 1960s reforms. Nonetheless, they were able to progress and push back. And so part of the message of the victim cult is, without denying the wrongs of the past, you better look at what leads to successful outcomes for peoples and entire groups today. Otherwise, you end up not making any progress. And Palestinians, by the way, vis-a-vis Israel, are a great example of this. And I profile them in an entire chapter in the victim cult.
Yeah, I think it was Henry Kissinger who said the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And it's almost as if they, at least their leadership, chose not to have a happy ending to their story because they loved the process of grievance more than they loved the outcome. I saw a tweet from Elon Musk the other day when he was talking about racism and slavery. And he said, I'm paraphrasing, he said, everyone in the world is descended from a slave. And I think he's probably right. And I think he had another line about, and many of us are descended from slave owners. And he wasn't talking about in the last generation or even the 5 generations. I think he's talking about maybe over the course of thousands of years, because it's true that even in the medieval feudal systems, there were indentured servants and people tied to the land as peasants. And if all you do is try and relitigate the past and either blame someone whose great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was a slaveholder, or seek victim status because your great-great-great-great-grandfather was a slave, you're never going to break free from that oppressor-oppressed dichotomy. It's like an endless feud with the past, isn't it?
Well, it is. And there are a number of things. When you think about slavery and the arguments these days about restitution or compensation, there are a number of things to point out. Number one, look, I'm in favor of compensation and restitution where wrong has been done in recent history. So, for example, if you're sitting in 1950 and you're looking at Japanese Americans or Japanese Canadians, it was absolutely the right thing to do to provide restitution for the property that was stolen, for the time they spent in internment camps. That makes sense. It was a theft of property, a theft of years of their life. Likewise, in the late 1700s, Quakers actually compensated their slaves that they freed because they realized a great wrong had been done. But that's a pretty short cause and effect timeline. If people now want to go back 200 years and say you should compensate me because my family was enslaved, that really kind of stretches, I think, the timeline for, and basically who's to blame. So the closer you are to an event, sure, there's some argument, and I point that out in the book, for compensation. In the short term, if I step on your foot, Ezra, and I break it, maybe I owe you a medical bill or whatever. But the further you go back on slavery, what's really fascinating, when I researched the victim cult, one of the chapters in there is all about slavery. And people forget this, that it was such a worldwide phenomenon and, regrettably taken for granted that people were naturally unequal and some should be slaves. But even white Europeans and white Brits were slaves. A lot of the Moorish and Muslim ships from the Mediterranean went all the way even to southern England and captured slaves off the coast of England for centuries, between the late 1500s all the way up to the 1700s. This was a problem. Moorish, ships that came and enslaved Europeans to the degree of 1 million people. Now, 1 million people is not as great as the Arab, African slave trade or the Atlantic slave trade between the Americas and Africa. Nonetheless, people forget that even Arabs and others were enslaving Europeans. And in fact, the term slavery even, that's where Slav comes from, initially slaves in Europe. So unfortunately, it was a tragic worldwide phenomenon, which the British, an imperial power, the colonialists that everyone likes to beat up on today, who were the ones that really ended slavery in human history. And there was a reason for that. And so why I wrote The Victim Cult, one of the reasons is to say, it doesn't do much good to say your ancestors beat up on my ancestors. It goes around, and everybody's ancestors beat up on everybody else's ancestors, to put not too fine a point on it, if you go back far enough in human history. So again, the question people have to ask themselves is, again, beyond tight cause and effect links that are provable and recent, what kind of a country do you want going forward? And it's not a good idea to have one based on historic grievances. I mean, that's why so many of our ancestors left Europe. We were tired of the fighting.